To everyone who's joining us, wherever you are, because this way of doing things lets that happen, near and far from here in Seattle, where my colleague Karen and myself and everyone else at the Elliott Bay Book Company, which is on Duwamish land in the city of Seattle, are delighted to be doing this program under somewhat unusual circumstances. We're recording it because of schedules, but that's also part of what is possible with this kind of reality, doing things virtually. And you, I think, will be gratified to be here whenever that can be, because it's going to be a conversation with Meghan O'Rourke for her extraordinary new book, The Invisible Kingdom, Reimagining Chronic Illness, with another writer with whom she has some good history, and that will get drawn out, but Esmé Weijun Wang, whose 2019 book, The Collected Schizophrenias, has had an incredible run. I mean, it's one of those books that came out seemingly in ancient history before the pandemic, but all through the pandemic has continued to go into readers' hands, certainly here and elsewhere as well. So, and there's common ground for both of them in what Esmé wrote in her book, and in this book, which Meghan has written. Meghan has come to us, we were just saying before we came on, a decade ago for an earlier book, a prose book called The Long Goodbye, which is an extraordinary memoir about the loss of her mother and chronicling the last days of life of this quite memorable woman who was also her mother. And she has also, we were also saying she's never gotten to come out to Seattle as a poet, but she's the author of 3 excellent collections of poetry: Sun and Days, Once, Half-Life. Karen, I think, is going to get things in the chat, links to these books of Meghan's as well as Esmé's. Meghan is joining us from, I believe, her home in Connecticut. She's the editor of the Yale Review. She's also written widely in other publications. And in this book, which they will be talking about, draws on all her ways of writing, of her work as a poet, as a journalist, and also in terms of this book about chronic illness, her own experiences as a patient going through this, and trying to come up, with her own explanations and understandings and comprehensions, and seeking them out from others. And she'll be doing this with Esmé. We have a few questions coming that came in previously. And Karen, my colleague, also will work in some, but I think you'll enjoy what you hear. Meghan will do a little bit of reading, and Esmé, who, as I say, they have some history, and she certainly knows this subject well in her life and in her work. So, and Esmé is joining us from San Francisco. So a few of us are on the West Coast doing this. Meghan's on the East, and you all are where you are. And we do have copies of The Invisible Kingdom and Collected Schizophrenias, as well as other books. I left out Esmé's also the author of an excellent novel that came out 5 or 6 years ago called The Border of Paradise, and I think has another one in the works called Self Creatures that will be coming at some point on the not too distant time, we hope. So with that, I will disappear from the scene, but reappear at the end, and to say thank you again for being with us, and to ask you to please join in giving good virtual attention and applause to Meghan O'Rourke, Esmé Weijun Wang, and The Invisible Kingdom. Thank you both.
Thank you so much, Rick. I'm going to read just for a few minutes to give everyone a taste of the book, a sound of the prose, and a sense of some of the preoccupations and questions it asks. And then I'm really looking forward to digging in to chatting with Esmé. So this is going to be probably about 5 to 6 minutes of reading. I'm going to start with a few paragraphs from the introduction, and then a few paragraphs from a chapter that considers what it's like to be ill in ways you don't understand. Introduction. The stories we tell about illness usually have startling beginnings. The fall at the supermarket, the lump discovered in the abdomen during a routine exam, the doctor's call. Not mine. I got sick the way Hemingway says you go broke, gradually and then suddenly. One way to tell my story would be to say that I got ill just after college in the late 1990s, when I began experiencing daily hives, dizziness, chronic pain, and drenching night sweats, long before any doctor believed I was sick. Another way to tell my story would be to say the illness took hold in the days after my mother died on Christmas Day of 2008. When I caught a virus, a debilitating fatigue overcame me. My lymph nodes ached for months, and I slid into an exhausted fog I attributed to grief. A month later, a doctor found that I had Epstein-Barr virus. Still another way would be to say that my illness became unignorable roughly 3 years after my mother's death, starting in January 2012 on a windy beach by a derelict hotel in Vietnam. Jim, my partner, and I were reading by the water when I noticed a strange rash on my inner arm. 7 or 8 raised bumps arranged in a circle. It looks like Braille, I thought. But what was it trying to tell me? The beach was a mess that day, scattered with the skeletal branches of palm trees. I was in the grips of the discomforting loneliness that can come when wild weather presses around you. Look at this, I said to Jim, who glanced at the angry, inflamed rash and said, "That's strange." It was strange, stranger than I imagined at the time. I had no idea then that I was living at the edge of medical knowledge. I had been intermittently unwell since I graduated from college in 1997, and now was getting steadily worse, like a person who can't swim, moving step by step into deep water. But no one knew why. At first, no one even believed I was ill. Not even I did, exactly. Trapped in a body that wasn't working, I embarked on a complicated and obsessive quest for answers. I eventually received an initial diagnosis of an autoimmune disease, but the diagnosis did not fully explain my symptoms. I tried many therapies and approaches toward healing, but in the meantime, the mysterious chronic illness I lived with got worse, not better, leaving me almost entirely unrecognizable to myself. As a child, I would wake early in the mornings with a sense of life's promise as sun drifted into my bedroom, feeling joy at what lay ahead. After I reached my sickest, I dreaded waking because my symptoms were always worse in the morning and because I knew the day would be full of suffering without explanation. One of the hardest things about being ill with a poorly understood disease is that most people find what you're going through incomprehensible, if they even believe you are going through it. In your loneliness, your preoccupation with an enduring new reality, you want to be understood in a way that you can't be. Pain is always new to the sufferer, but loses its originality for those around him, the French writer Alphonse Daudet observes in The Land of Pain. Everyone will get used to it, except me. Worrying that your symptoms are psychosomatic or even imagined is part of life for many people with poorly understood illnesses. Although the experience of illness is not just in the head, it is also not just in the body. The person enduring such an illness faces a difficult balancing act. On the one hand, she must advocate for herself, even when doctors are indifferent or ignorant, and not be deterred when she knows something is wrong. On the other, she must also be willing to ask whether an obsessive attention to symptoms is going to lead to better health. The patient has to hold in mind 2 contradictory modes, in other words, insistence on the reality of the disease and resistance to her own catastrophic fears. I found it hard in the fall and winter of 2012 to strike that balance. I was increasingly worried. After all, a terrible anxiety attends chronic illness. Over time, it becomes difficult to untangle the suffering from symptoms like pain from the suffering inflicted by the anxiety over the possibility of more pain and worse outcomes in the future. This does not mean that the illness is in the mind. Rather, the mind, that machine for making meaning, makes endless meanings of its new state, which may themselves influence the experience. It was in this recursive hall of mirrors, trying to adjust to my body's ailments, that I lived. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was so beautiful. And this book is so important. I'm going to get to how we first met, which is related to this book in a moment. But first, I want to ask, So this is a book unlike any I've read before, especially about illness. And I was curious as to what you think it's like to write a book like this, which blends journalism and personal experience about invisible illness and the factors surrounding it while experiencing invisible illness yourself.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, Esmé. As you know, I love your book, The Collected Schizophrenias, which is just an extraordinary book. This book, yeah, it's entangled with me, and it's recursive in that I was living it as I was writing it, right? So when I first started writing this book in the spring of 2013, all I knew is that I had an autoimmune disease. And I didn't know yet, even, I was hoping that was the answer that would explain all of my health problems. As it turned out, it was not. I didn't even know that yet. And I had an inkling that something else was pretty wrong, right? But I started out blind, in other words, right? So the book, in retrospect, represents my incredible need at that time to try to find language for this experience that was so inchoate and somatic and yet vague and anti-dramatic to everyone else and yet life-altering to me. And in particular, the years between 2011 and 2014, 15 were years of utter mystery, right? In which I was really sick. And at first, I didn't even call myself sick. And eventually I started to, that's when I began writing the book. But there were just very few answers, and there was very little language and no frameworks that I knew of for really understanding my illness. So a long answer here, but part of what I'm saying is that from the beginning, I felt driven to make this a record of my own lived experience of illness, precisely because when someone said, "How are you?" I couldn't answer that question. And to make it a reported historical, cultural, social examination and argument, because my intuition, even at that time, was that there was a historical, social reason for the fact that this experience was so invisible and there was no language for it. And I needed to find the answers to why that was. You know, it was like a burning need. It was really a quest. And so from the beginning, I knew there was going to be research and personal narrative intertwined. And from a craft writing perspective, that was really hard. From a lived illness, it was really hard too, because research was challenging with the brain fog I was experiencing. So we can talk more about that. So it was this burning need, and then it also presented a lot of challenges, and I was kind of writing in real time and unwriting in real time. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like this burning need for answers is a really common part of the narrative for people who have chronic illness, and particularly this narrative of there must be one diagnosis that can answer why I'm so sick. And then it becomes like, oh no, I'm like collecting diagnoses like a little magpie, except it's not a collection I particularly want. And then it becomes, kind of suspicious to the people around you, because then they're like, why do you have like 7 diagnoses? And so to get back to that one diagnosis thing, I think many people came to your writing about illness through your piece in the New Yorker in 2013, titled "What's Wrong with Me?" When I first started getting sick, lots of people pointed me to that piece in particular, even though it had been a while back. So I'm curious as to, well, actually, can you talk a little bit about that piece and then how you went from that piece to this entire book?
Yeah. So that piece represents the very beginning of the book, which is to say, I was going through this experience. I had just received a diagnosis that I had an autoimmune disease, Hashimoto's thyroiditis. I also had this, you're in the realm of the not understood when you got the diagnoses that have like idiopathic or undifferentiated in the title. So I had like idiopathic, undifferentiated connective tissue disease, which my doctor was like, it just means we don't know, but something's wrong with your connective tissue and your immune system is doing something to it, right? So I, at that point, found it really interesting that in this hyper-diagnostic age where we seem to rush to diagnose people, things, conditions, where, even ice cream headache has a term. My son can get diagnosed with palatine ganglioneuralgia. Like, why, when I was so sick, had it taken so much persistence to get a diagnosis, right? And I think when I did get that diagnosis, I had the hope that many people do, especially maybe early in an illness experience, that was the answer, right? Like, I had gotten sick, I wanted to get better, I needed a diagnosis. Okay, got the diagnosis, I'm gonna get better, more or less, right? And so the piece you can see is already complicating that narrative, right? It's already saying, well, I've gotten this, I've taken the thyroid hormones, I'm still not myself. My doctor says I need to adjust to life as a person with autoimmune disease, which we know is a systemic condition you can't really undo. Often, if you have one autoimmune disease, you have others. So I had accepted that much, but I still was, I think, really in this conventional Western medicine framework. Well, no, I was emerging from this framework that sort of sees the body as a car, right? And each part has a separate caretaker, the carburetor doctor, the tire doctor, and you go and you get like a tune-up and then you hopefully get better. And I think it just didn't occur to me that I could have many more problems, even as I was like, something's still not right. So when I began really writing the book, at that point, I had gone through another 1.5 years of being much sicker than I was even in the New Yorker piece. I got like really, really sick after the publication of that piece, and learned that I had Lyme disease that had gone undiagnosed. But I will tell you, Esmé, I have been collecting diagnoses in the 10 years I've been writing the book, and the most recent came, literally as I was like sending the manuscript to the publisher, in came a diagnosis of a genetic condition that made sense of so much of my life that even 10 years of writing hadn't surfaced that till the very end. So I hope we do talk about that. But part of the work of the book and of my experience was that of realizing that, as the book lays out, one of the challenging things about many of these particular immune-mediated diseases is that you often end up with multiple diagnoses. And as you say, people around you can be incredibly suspicious of that. But yeah, I have 4 distinct diagnoses that probably all have some interrelationship,
Yeah, I think it can also start to feel like, am I really so unlucky that I have this and this and this? Or maybe it's just, wait, well, maybe these things are all connected. You were talking about the thinking that one often has in the beginning of the whole journey type. I hate to call it a journey. It makes me feel like it's The Bachelor or something. But anyway, in the beginning of the whole journey where you're like, oh, I've got this one diagnosis and I'll get better. I actually first talked to you in 2014 when you were beginning work on this book. We talked on the phone and you were interviewing me for this book. And this was when you mentioned to me at the end of the call, you might want to get checked out for Lyme disease, which then set off my whole, journey of my own. But I do.
I rarely do this, but I really think you need to Lyme disease because it was so clear you had Lyme disease.
Yeah. Oh God. Anyway. Yeah. So I was talking to you very early on in the process, and the book has just come out. And so I was wondering, what was your more general research process like? As a process nerd, I want to know.
Process. I love talking about process. It was messy. It happened in fits and starts. But when I really began working on the book in 2014, I interviewed about 100 patients, people, I like to say, all of whom were living with some version of chronic illness or suspected chronic illness. Some of them didn't have an answer for what was wrong when I first interviewed them. Pretty much all of them, I think all but 3, ended up within 2 years with a really clear-cut medical diagnosis. but had all been told some version of, you're stressed, this is in your head, your anxiety is driving this, which we can talk about the role that anxiety may play, but basically their conditions were being reduced to anxiety when they had a more multifactorial cause, right? And so as I was talking to people, and because I wanted to know at that point, my intuition, my inkling was what had happened to me was not unusual, right? My suspicion was, okay, if I'm experiencing this, millions of Americans are invisibly ill, right? And you have to remember, this was, about 10 years ago, so there was less discussion of these conditions too. But I wanted to make sure as a reporter that inkling was true, that it wasn't just, narcissism that made me think, right? And I mean, so that was what the process of that reporting was really important, because it really helped me identify what the major concerns of the book should be, because here were these patterns that kept cropping up. Women being disbelieved by doctors, challenges getting whole body care, medicine's struggle with chronic illness care, the desire to be recognized, to have your illness be validated, even if there's not a name for it. These were powerful themes that emerged in those interviews. So then the question to me became, why? Right? I mean, I think sometimes as a writer, you have to be willing to look at things that we all take a little bit for granted and just be like, why is it like this? And I will tell you that to me, it seemed so weird that you go to a doctor and they're suspicious of you. Like, I just found that on the face of it, even though I knew that was how it was, I found it so strange. I kept thinking, if I go to a restaurant and sit down and order, tilapia, the chef doesn't come out and say, are you sure you're hungry? Maybe you just want something crunchy to munch on, so there's this very interesting phenomenon of medicine's struggle to take at face value the testimony of patients. And I wanted to understand why that had happened. So that's when I started reading. I read so much. And I was clearly procrastinating too, right? I just read hundreds of books and talked to historians. I was on a fellowship at Radcliffe, talked to medical historians, talked to autoimmunity researchers, met with the father of autoimmune disease, and I really threw myself into the research. And did very little writing, but kept a lot of notes. And I have to say, I think going back to your first question, that was probably something I needed to do for myself as well as for the book, right? That there was something incredibly meaningful to me about just collecting all of this evidence that there was, a lot behind the problem that I was facing, and also evidence that there were researchers out there who saw this problem for what it was and really cared about doing the science that would help get us out and get us answers and diagnostics and treatment. Yeah, that was a rambling answer, but I hope that helps.
No, that's great. That's a great. So, you were just saying some of the researchers you talked to had more sympathetic ideas, and I'm thinking about the first neurologist I ever saw saying, as soon as I walked into the office, like, all mental illnesses will be able to be explained by autoimmune disease, but we're not there yet. And is this true, do you think? And kind of more generally, what can a better understanding of autoimmune illness bring us as a society?
Yeah. I think you and I could talk probably for hours just about the ways in which, as a patient, you encounter this really strange mind-body dichotomy when lived experiences of the utter integration in many ways, right, of mind and body. So what I mean to say is autoimmune disease, which is driven by the immune system, it's the immune system actually attacking the body itself and creating inflammation or damage, right? Sort of collateral damage too, not just the autoimmune activity, but the collateral damage of inflammation that can happen when your body is sort of overactive in its immune system or just improperly active. And one of the things that researchers are starting to understand is that, that all sorts of pathogens, such as SARS-CoV-2, the coronavirus, can actually get into the brain and lead the immune system to start to kind of do things in the brain, which for a long time there was more belief that there was more distinction, that there was this blood-brain barrier, that things didn't get into the brain, that the brain didn't experience inflammation in quite these ways. And, I think what we're seeing, and one of the models I talk about in the book, is that infections can have really startling array of after effects in the human body in a portion of the population, maybe because they're genetically susceptible, maybe because they get two infections at the same time, maybe because they're experiencing acute stress or trauma when they get an infection. But in any case, there's this whole host of things that can happen to us after an infection, some of it being autoimmune disease, and some of it being brain changes that more and more, and I talk about a few of them briefly in my book, we're tracing things that have been regarded as mental illnesses, like OCD, even schizophrenia is connected to the flu virus, right? These mental illnesses are increasingly being connected to abnormal immune activity, and to very specific genetic reactions to infection. So a lot of the researchers that I talked to were like, in 100 years, people are going to look back and we're going to look really in another era in the way we talk and think about, chronic illness, mental illness. Like, they're going to see this as much more dimensionally integrated and hopefully have a much more complex and, systemic way of thinking about the deep interrelationship between mental illness and immune-mediated illness. Yeah.
A little bit earlier, you just kind of briefly mentioned women and autoimmune illness, and it made me think about this quote from a novel Gillian Flynn wrote, Sharp Objects, which I actually might use as an epigraph for my new novel, but it's about how men experience, the flu or a snapped bone or, whatever, and women get consumed. That's extremely paraphrased. I wonder what you think about that and about the role of autoimmune illness and invisible illness in women in particular.
Yeah. So again, one of the mysteries of these illnesses is that they, in the majority, overwhelmingly affect women. So autoimmune disease, people with autoimmune disease, something like 80% of them are women. There's a few autoimmune diseases that affect mostly men. Long COVID, mostly women. Even ongoing effects from Lyme disease seems to be mostly women. So we have this fact, which is that there's all these immune system-driven diseases that are affecting a lot of women. And the question is why? We don't exactly know the answers. And the researchers I spoke to have competing theories and different guesses. There's things that are biological, like estrogen, right? Estrogen clearly plays a role in our immune system. Women who are in particularly moments of their life where they're experiencing hormonal shifts, after pregnancy, during menopause, perimenopause, there's a lot of autoimmune activity can set in around those times. But there's also the question of sort of social stress and other things too, right, that are really hard to codify. And so we just don't know. We have two X's, right? Maybe there's genetic mutations that we have two of, so that would lead to you're more consumed. Our immune systems tend to be a little more active than men. So we saw this in COVID, like with acute COVID, more men were dying. Well, that's because our immune systems actually are a little more, especially as we're older, they're kind of more robust in some ways. That's an oversimplification. But that also means they can go awry. But there's really fascinating research that shows that chronic stress, like everyday stress, over time, when you're, the example we're always given is that, in the old days, stress was supposed to just be like, you're on the savannah, as a lion comes, you run, and the stress helps your cardiovascular system, make you run faster and you're not digesting so you can get away. right? But that today we're just constantly stressed. We know that like email pings raise your heart rate and raise your cortisol. So the point is that researchers have studied chronic stress, and they found that each time you are in this state of stress, you're kind of ratcheting up and down your immune system in this really delicately coordinated set of hormonal interactions. And the more times you do that, the more likelihood there is of a mistake. So whether that applies just to women, whether women are more stressed than men and also get that, we don't know, but there's certainly, you know, a lot of women I spoke to who were juggling work and children and family and misogyny or abuse, right? All of these things that impact women more than men in many ways, in this kind of society where we're frenetically connected and living impossible lives. So that's clearly a social piece we need to look at.
Yeah, the thing about chronic stress is, it reminds me of a psychiatrist I used to see. And every time I would come to her with some kind of issue, if I was having some kind of episode or something particularly significant was happening, she would always say, is there some kind of stress that's been happening in your life? And I always thought that was the most maddening thing, because I always said every time, like, when is there not stress? Like, I can always tell you something that you might consider a trigger or, you know, something that's caused this current situation, but it would just be kind of facile. Like, it's me just giving you a thing, because everything is stressful at all times, or like there are always stressors. And so that, I think that definitely fits in with what you're saying about chronic stress.
Well, and I mean, I think what's so frustrating is, so the stress part, the middle of the book, which is where I talk about mind and body, is like by far the hardest part to write. Just to elaborate on what you just said for a sec, because I got this too, right? Well, did your burning neuropathy start when something stressful happened? I was like, no, I was staring out a beautiful window and a bird was flying past. Like, it felt facile to reduce everything to stress. And it also felt like everyone wanted my symptoms to just revert back, to just point back to stress. I think because they lacked answers for why I was having these symptoms. So in the book, I try to really delicately balance, or not delicately balance, but to explore in a more rigorous way frameworks for, you know, when to think about stress, and also to point out that, sure, maybe stress plays a role in these illnesses, but why do you and I have them and my friend over here doesn't, right? Because that's the question that goes not asked when the doctor goes immediately to, is there stress in your life, right? Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's so important. And you did touch on anxiety and chronic illness, which I want to come back to later. But just to go on back to your kind of process, and I still want to ask you more questions about process, but were there any books that you kind of used as touchstones while you were working on this one? Like, I wish to have this kind of aspect of this book, or were there books that you kept nearby or close at hand?
Yeah, I mean, the major one was Susan Sontag's Illness as Metaphor, which the book is very clearly indebted to. I take as an epigraph the first line of her book, Illness as Metaphor, from 1978, which argues that, you know, often when there is a disease we don't understand very well and we can't treat effectively, we stigmatize it by psychologizing it and telling, what she means by metaphor is we tell a cultural story about it, right? Not that we shouldn't use metaphors when you and I are talking about our pain. What the metaphor she's critiquing is societies tell stories that are metaphorical about biological illness when they don't understand them. For example, were you experiencing stress? That's a type A person. Type A people get chronic illness. That's a metaphorical cultural narrative. So it seemed so true to me that she was talking about cancer, because at the time, breast cancer was really associated with repressed emotions. And it was thought to be that these repressed women, like intellectuals, right, would get breast cancer because they weren't emotional and in touch with themselves. And so that's just enraged her. She uses the word enraging at the beginning of the book. And she really set out to kind of decimate that idea and to show how it's just clear that when we don't understand, we we tell this narrative that's psychological. The same thing seemed to me true of autoimmune diseases, which are rising at epidemic rates. And so I wanted to quite explicitly like be updating illness as metaphor for the 21st century, right? That said, Sontag is one of my heroes, but is very intellectual and non-personal writer. She doesn't bring herself into the text. She had breast cancer. She doesn't mention it in the book directly. And, you know, I actually tried to write this very Sontagian first chapter, and I showed it to someone and he was like, it's fine, it's like a little dense and like a little dry, like a little boring, you know? And I just remember thinking, God, I have to bring myself in. I am someone who writes about myself. As much as I was struggling with that, but that's part of the way the reader is going to connect to the story is by showing the specificity of my lived experience, which may connect to them in some way. So then I started looking at a lot of memoirs, and in particular, a lot of older memoirs. So a book that meant a lot to me was really a journal. It was by this English naturalist named W.N.P. Barbellion, I believe, and it's called The Journal of a Disappointed Man. He had multiple sclerosis before medicine knew what that was. So he's just writing, and he was a naturalist. He was a really fascinating guy, and he could write. And he was really interested in the natural world. So he just had these very fresh metaphors and descriptions for what he was experiencing, because it was before our time and he was trying to find language, and that meant a lot to me. I'm trying to think, you know, and then I had read Eula Biss's On Immunity. I'd written a lot of my book when I read On Immunity, but I thought the way that she wove together research and little bits of memoir, you know, I knew I was going to have a lot more memoir, but I thought, okay, this is edifying the way these two things ramify one another, right? That they're not at odds with each other narratively, they're entangled. And I knew I wanted that kind of entanglement. I'm sure there's, you know, a million more books that were really important, but those are some of the ones that come to mind.
Oh, I always love asking writers about the books they keep nearby during certain projects. So thank you. On kind of the other side of the coin, without throwing anybody under the bus, has there been anything about existing books about illness or chronic illness that you find frustrating, or that you wanted to kind of, you would look at and go like, oh, I don't want to do that with this book?
Yeah. You know, it's funny. Although I read a lot, there were certain books that seemed potentially close to my project that were starting to come out when I was writing, so I just didn't read because I thought I'm already so far in and I just can't know what this person has done. So there's a lot of books that I have missed that I should have read. You would think I would have read, but I just didn't read, because I actually ended up doing a lot of historical research, and a lot of my reading was science, histories, like political, weirdly, all the stuff that didn't make it in, but like political science. Why is medicine structured the way it is? But that said, there were two things I suspected about a lot of the illness stories we have, which is to say, I think more broadly, the culture prefers stories of overcoming, right? And stories where wisdom is somehow found. And I wanted to really clarify for myself and for all of us who live with illness and those around us that our rush to find the silver lining silences and delegitimates the actual suffering and process of illness, right? We don't have to say journey, but the process, the day-to-day, right? And we are just so quick, I think often out of good-heartedness, to say to somebody, but, you know, at least you've, you know, it was someone, a dear friend said, you know, at least you're writing this beautiful book. And I was like, well, but I would rather not have written the book and not been sick, right? I would choose that. So I did want to I did want to not write a memoir of tidy resolution. I really wanted this to represent the messy inchoateness, the uncertainty, the grappling toward understanding, and then the undoing of everything you thought you knew, and then the rebuilding and the undoing. And I wanted it to have that untidiness in it, which was really hard formally to figure out, okay, how do I make it untidy, but also help the reader finish? Yeah.
Yeah, referring to untidiness, one thing that really sticks out to me from a medical anthropology class I took back in the day was that there's this concept of the sick role. And a major part of the sick role is that the person who is sick will get better. And if the person doesn't get better, it really frustrates the community around them. You know, while they're sick, people will take care of them. It's like very nice, etc. But yeah, part of the sick role is that the person will inevitably get better.
That is, his name is like Talbot or Talcott Parsons, I think. And
oh my gosh, good pull. See, I don't remember that.
Yes, because I wrote about it at one point and then I actually took it out.
Yeah, I also took it out, I think, of collected schizophrenia. Anyway.
So you probably had this experience too, where like the book, speaking of process, the book was about like 20,000 words longer, quite a bit longer. And I took a lot out, which who knows, right? But there's definitely like a director's cut version of the book that has a lot more science and a lot more things like that, where I was trying to really look at the sociology, the anthropology of the sick role. Yeah, there's some wild stuff in there, but absolutely. And in our medical system, it's really clear that doctors are trained to fix and not to live with, in an existentially complex way, illness, right? And so I think there's a wild quote I talked about in the book where it's talking about like the good patient, you know, takes the drug and gets better, and the bad patient doesn't, right? The bad patient stays sick. So yeah.
Yeah, it also reminds me of, speaking of doctors, this meme that I'm obsessed with that I once saw, and it had to do with like doctor from medical drama. I will turn the world upside down to find out what's wrong with you. And, you know, like doctor in real life is like, well, I try to, that's it, you know?
Yeah, I was, and they were like, well, you needed, they were like, brought up House, and I was like, right, House is the opposite kind of because he was saying, well, House is sort of abrasive, and that's what, and I was like, well, but House is passionately committed to the answer, right? And that was the precise problem I had. And I say in the book to my partner at one point, just want someone to be curious about what is wrong with me. I need a medical detective.
Yeah, I also referred to House during my life with illness. Okay, so speaking of so I think you've addressed this already with some of the things that you've talked about, which I think a lot of people who don't live with illness might find surprising. But I was wondering, what is something, or, you know, as many things as you want to describe, what is something that you wish people who aren't chronically ill could take away from your book?
Yeah. I think the overwhelming reality of this experience and how challenging it is, especially with, I think, a whole host of chronic illnesses, including chronic pain, chronic migraines, just to never know how the day is going to go, right? And the toll that that takes. And I think that a lot of people who live adjacent to chronically ill people just can't help thinking of them as being like fussy or difficult. I mean, I actually got 2 letters from readers recently where they said, your book has helped me relate to my mother, my partner, my daughter, because it's hard. I mean, and let's say it's hard to be you know, if chronic illness is hard, it also impacts those around us, but it's really hard to talk about this. And I think what happens is that those who are adjacent to it but not living it often do just feel like it's a personality trait of the sick person, that they are, you know, in my case, I had a lot of, you know, in retrospect, coping mechanisms that I didn't even understand at the time as such. Like, I really need to eat dinner at this time. I didn't like to eat large meals because this genetic condition I have makes it really hard for me to digest, right? Things like that I didn't know why, but I was very fussy around. I wasn't fussy, that's the word I'm trying to get over. I was particular, I had ways of getting through the day. So that's one thing I want to convey, is that what may seem like a personality trait is probably a reality of the disease. And likewise, I've been really thinking about this. Like, I do want to say that people living with chronic illness are so strong. And when they talk about pain, it's probably so bad that they've finally decided to say something about it. And I feel, again, that those around us think we're talking about pain all the time. And I'm like, dude, you don't know, like, I never talk about pain, but now I am. And I lost you there.
No, I'm here. My video died, or it disappeared for some reason. I will come back, but when I can, let's see. Is this working? Sorry, everybody. I wonder if this can be edited out.
I'm going to pop back in while you're trying to find your video, yes, and say this might be a good time to answer some questions from the audience. And we have one here. And actually, I think both of you might answer this. Do you have any advice on dealing with the lingering fear and the sense of dread, of future flare-ups? At this point, it feels worse than my actual illness.
Yeah, that's the reading at the beginning that I did, I think, speaks to that a little bit, right? That there's this living, and you're trying to find this notch between, insisting on to people who don't always believe this is real, and also like, I totally know what this I totally relate to this question that, there are these times where, right, I'm just dreading. I got pretty sick again in November. And then since then I've been like, am I getting sick? Am I getting better? It's so hard. So I have no great answer to that, except that it is a reality that we live with that's draining. And I do try to mind my mind, as someone just said to me in another call. Like, just observe and then try to keep track of what's going on and try to identify my own triggers and avoid them. But it's one of the major challenges. Yeah. I'm sure Esmé has something.
Yeah, I agree that it's a major challenge, but I would suggest this, which is that to me, it's a very similar situation as, we all know we're going to die. And yet we somehow manage to not think about that every second of our lives. It would be possible, I think, to just think, I'm going to die, I'm going to die, I'm going to die, just every second of our lives. But we manage to forget it for, these swaths of time. And so how do we do that? And I think it's because it is just purely too exhausting to think about our deaths, our inevitable deaths every moment of every day. And so while I don't have any great advice about not worrying about future flare-ups, I guess I would just point to, like, how do you not think about dying every second of the day, and to kind of take some info from that, or some intel from that experience. It is possible, I guess, to think about our future deaths every moment of every day, but yeah, I think generally we try not to do that.
I have just one thing to add to that, which is that when I was pregnant, I have an autoimmune disease that made it much likelier that I would have like a stillbirth in the third trimester, and which I did not have. But it was like this, like I couldn't stop worrying, what if this would happen? And so I did see a therapist who specialized in helping people with chronic illnesses and other things. And she was like, just go off the latest piece of information. All you can ever do is go off the latest piece of information. So that's your job. Like, don't worry about it until something bad happens. Easier said than done, but it was helpful to me to think of it that way.
Yeah, and that causes me to touch on something else that I cannot help but mention, which is that if you are able to find a therapist who specializes in chronic illness, that is so hugely helpful. I left my last therapist because she really was at a loss to talk to me about my being ill, because all she could say was like, yeah, that really stinks, which to me was not helpful. And so I've been seeing the same therapist since about 2013, who specializes in working with people with chronic illness. And it's so helpful.
Totally. Yeah.
It's wonderful to even know that such specialists exist. I mean, that's really, I think, be really helpful in its own way. So Meghan, you wrote about some changes in healthcare organizations and how they're dealing with chronic illness, and particularly with long COVID. And can you talk a little bit about this, and maybe some changes, that positive things, but also things that you think might need to be improved?
Yeah, so one of the things I try to lay out in the book is that, again, the social, cultural reasons that so many of us struggle for diagnosis and care. And, two really obvious ones are that medicine is better at acute care and fixing than it is at chronic illness care, and recognizing and treating with empathy and being in that kind of support system. We also have this really siloed system that we've touched on, where you're seeing specialists for all these different parts of your body, and mine never talk to each other, right? So there's no person looking at the whole. The third part of that too is that medicine thinks about disease and illness in this very mechanistic, isolated way. So it's not just that you have to go to the specialist, but also that what they offer you is often very isolated and based on kind of crisis care rather than prevention and life experience. So to give an example, we had to invent a whole new kind of medicine called palliative care to help train doctors in how to help people die, because doctors weren't used to saying to patients, okay, here's this reality that's not going away. How do you want to live your life? How do you want to spend your days? And Esmé, I don't know if you experienced this, but no doctor ever said to me, I really don't know what's wrong with you. I really believe you're this sick. What's your worst symptom and how do we get you to live with it? Like, that would have been so helpful. And no one said it to me. So what I do think long COVID is doing, the scope of it, the crisis of it, is it is bringing national attention to the need for more integrated care centers for the delivery of care, coordinated care for autoimmune disease, immune-mediated diseases. I write about a place in New York, the Mount Sinai Center for Post-COVID Care, but more broadly, the hospital is full of doctors who are talking in real time and trying to really help patients. And one of the things they're doing is they're really trying to tend to the fact that long COVID patients are coming in with like acute food sensitivities, in addition to many other problems, autonomic nervous disorder, cardiac problems. But okay, we can help you figure out which foods make you sick. How do you get better? Medicine usually didn't want to touch that. And so I'm hoping that, we first recognize the scope of the crisis of long COVID as the crisis it is, and that B, more academic medical centers with the funding that is coming in, which is not enough, build these multi-dimensional centers where not only are the doctors coordinating care, but they are taking almost like a different dimensional view onto what's needed for patients. And there are a few places like this. There's this Autoimmunity Institute in Pennsylvania also. It's starting to happen. And the question is, can we get the funding and the will to really make a cultural change in medicine?
Esmé, do you have anything that you'd like to add?
Add to that particular question?
Yeah.
Or in general? No, I had a question about long COVID, but it was more just like if you have anything you want to talk about regarding long COVID. Which
that's a great question.
I'd
love to hear that too.
Yeah, I mean, long COVID is, unfortunately, the tragic thing about long COVID is that we could have had the tools to help people with long COVID if we had been listening to patients with invisible illnesses for the previous decades, right? If we had listened to patients with ME/CFS we could have known a lot more about how to help this crisis, but because we didn't, not we, but because medical science didn't, we are just, as one researcher put it, he's like, we just don't have any tools in the toolbox, and we better fill that toolbox up now. So long COVID probably is a kind of umbrella term for different pathways to, and slightly different manifestations perhaps, of after effects triggered by SARS-CoV-2, much in the way we were talking about with these other conditions. And some of those may be autoimmune, some of them are this thing called dysautonomia, where your nervous system gets dysregulated by what we don't know exactly, the virus itself, the immune system. Some people with long COVID have micro blood clots. There's just, we're learning more every day, right? Many people in the model that Esmé was talking about are going to have multiple of these problems and need this kind of capacious, coordinated approach. And one of the things I see already that really disturbs me is if in the book I'm trying to identify these places in our cultural narratives where our discomfort with the complexity and messiness of reality leads us to look away, I see that playing out in real time with long COVID, which is to say, I see all these doctors being like, well, this is an umbrella term. So like, I don't want to, this is just messy. Like, this is not right. Like, people are saying there's so many people with long COVID, but clearly it's not that many. And to me, that's the wrong response, right? Because it's like, yes, there's a lot we don't know. There are people being pulled in this bucket who maybe will end up being able to disentangle, and maybe some of them really have a clear-cut autoimmune disease triggered by, but the phrase is a phenomenon describing how many people get sick after a mild case of the virus, and sort of this, I don't know. So I really do hope that we have a national conversation about the need to center patients' experiences and not get kind of caught up in terminology. This happened with Lyme disease. It's very similar. Yeah, and we realize that viruses and pathogens can make people really, really sick in a whole host of ways. And we need to invest a lot of money into diagnostics and treatment. And again, reform how we think about what it means to care for patients with these illnesses.
Yeah, I have seen, and it's mostly disability advocates who are saying this. I've seen a lot of disability advocates and other people kind of shouting about, you know, we need to look at long COVID. And I have noticed that it doesn't seem like there is money going to long COVID research or research into these things you were just mentioning, the kind of after effects of certain viruses or many viruses. And I was just wondering, you addressed the kind of psychological aspect of it, which is people don't like to deal with messy things, which is very true. But what do you think are the more practical aspects of why they're not funding this kind of stuff?
That's a great question. So with long COVID, they are funding it a little more than some of these other diseases, but of course it remains to be seen. Does this happen? We just saw that Biden asked for all this stuff and it got shrunk, even things like antivirals, right? So I'm always like, what's going to actually happen? I think the NIH has promised a certain amount of funding, et cetera. But, wait, what was I going to say? But I think that there's still this challenge listening to patients talk about the complexity of research needed. And so people are taking the funding where there is funding and sort of slotting it into pre-existing models for thinking about these diseases. So actually there's a lot of studies starting up basically to deliver a framework of long COVID that suggests that, guess what? It's driven by the anxiety you felt when you got the virus. And sure, there are some real changes, but like the crisis of anxiety of COVID is part of what triggered long COVID, right? So there's studies like that. And there's studies that are saying, these patients need exercise, they need to get conditioned again, and we're going to give them traditional exercise, PT, which we know doesn't work for many long COVID patients. They need something much more tailored. And in fact, exercise can exacerbate long COVID. So I think that even when there is funding, there's just this practical, repetition of pre-existing cognitive biases. And then secondarily, I think quickly, I'll just say, medicine is inherently conservative. People are afraid to be wrong, and medical studies are controlled by senior people who usually have an idea that they're known for, and approve studies that replicate their ideas and will promote their ideas. So if you have a bunch of people coming in and saying, the way we've been doing this is wrong, we want to take this, bring a really new idea in, we want to break the paradigm open, it's really hard to get those studies funded because A, you have senior people saying no, and B, it's hard for people in the first place to be brave enough as scientists to say something really new, because science and medicine medical science at least doesn't really reward that paradigm shift. There's a term for this, the Semiwise Reflex, right? Where people with new ideas are often punished. And the term comes from a doctor named Ignaz Semmelweis who said, we think he thought women were dying in childbirth because doctors were not washing their hands. And in fact, that midwives were having higher success rates because they did wash their hands. And he got roundly ostracized and had a nervous breakdown because the medical profession turned on him. So a lot of the researchers I talked to, because I've been asking this question, and I'm saying, are you hopeful? And they said, we're hopeful there's a little more funding, but the problem is, how do you break open research, and how do you get medical science to have like a codified avenue for sort of experimental approaches? Like we almost need an arm of research that's designed to be experimental, where that's what you're rewarded for, because we don't have that.
The X-Files of the medical research.
That's literally what the guy said. He was like something like, yeah, it's like the, right. Yeah. The incubator stage. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I had one last question, and I think in many ways this book is, for me, really a book about how important listening is, whether you're listening to the new research or listening to your own body or listening to what your patients are telling you. And you wrote in your book, and I love this quote, listening is hard, but it's also a fundamental moral act.
I think that's from the wonderful medical sociologist Arthur Frank, right? That's
yes.
Not me. Everyone should know that's Arthur Frank, who is just another book, actually, Esmé, that I kept close and relied on, though again, quite technical, but it just someone who is a sociologist who really understands what it is to be ill. And yes, that's the governing idea of the book, that listening is hard. It is also a fundamental moral act. And the book is really invested in trying to remind us all that illness is not a solitary experience. It's not monadic, as Frank says, it's actually dyadic. We're always in dialogue with others when we're ill, as much as we may feel isolated and society may want to hide us away or not see us. But in fact, illness is a social experience, and we owe it to others to listen to them, because as hard as that may be, it does remind us of our mortality, right? Which, as Esmé said, we like to push away, but it's our fundamental human condition. And I think it's an ethical act, right? And part of what we also need to do when I criticize medicine as a system, it's partly because there's a lot of doctors who want to be able to deliver that ethical act, but find themselves constrained by bureaucratic realities. And so we need to remind ourselves that when we talk about healthcare, we're not talking about dollars and cents. We're also talking about this ethical act of listening and of witness.
I think that's a great note to end our program. So I'm going to invite Rick back to send us off.
Thank you, Karen, and thank you, Megan and Esmé. This has been great for those of you who do join us. We look forward to your getting to hear them and to read Megan's book, which says even more to what they've spoken to today, and Esmé as well. Keep that in mind. Many of you have found your way to that in the last few years. So thank you both, and thank you, Karen, again, to everyone. And take care, be well as we can be with all this. And yeah, good travels to you, Esmé, coming up, and everything else to both. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Esmé.
Thank you so much. Bye.